True stories can sometimes be the most compelling, and with so many films being based on them, we wanted to find out just how true they really are. I'm Tom.
And I'm Matt.
This is Real or Fake, and this week we're looking at the space disaster film, Apollo 13.
Directed by Ron Howard and released in 1995, the movie tells the story of the aborted Apollo 13 lunar landing, after an explosion threatens to end the mission and potentially the lives of the 3 crew members.
We're going to be getting into the plot, but first, let's take a look at the Apollo space program. The Apollo space program was the third US human spaceflight program carried out by NASA. Best known for successes such as Apollo 11, the first mission to land the man on the moon, the Apollo space program wasn't without some significant and tragic setbacks.
But despite this, Apollo had some incredible success on top of its 6 successful moon landings. It stands alone in sending manned missions beyond low Earth orbit. Apollo 8 was the first mission to orbit another celestial body, and the missions funded the construction of the Johnson and the Kennedy space centers. Apollo also laid the foundation for NASA's future human spaceflight programs.
Apollo 13 is the 7th manned Apollo mission and was the 3rd intended to land on the surface of the moon. It was launched on April 11th, 1970, and after an explosion to an oxygen tank, they were forced to abort the lunar landing, and it returned on April 17th, 1970. Described as a successful failure by the commander Jim Lovell, Apollo 13 stands as an incredible example of human resilience and human spirit. But how closely does the film stick to the actual events of the spaceflight?
Let's first take a closer look at the crew. Generally, the film sticks pretty close to who these guys were, but there are some interesting things that you might not know.
First up, we've got Jim Lovell, who's played by Tom Hanks in the film. Jim Lovell was the commander of the Apollo 13 mission. He was also the command module pilot for Apollo 8. He was one of only 24 people to fly to the moon, and he was the only one to go twice and not land at all.
Next up, we've got Jack Swigert, played by Kevin Bacon. He was the command module pilot for Apollo 13. Like we see in the film, Jack was the first to let Houston know that there was a problem with the ship. But the famous line that has become so synonymous with this film,
"Hey, we've got a problem here.
Houston, we have a problem,"
was actually a little bit different.
Okay, Houston, we've had a problem here. Houston, we've had a problem.
The third member of the crew was Fred Hayes, played by Bill Paxton. Interestingly, he was the backup lunar module pilot for Apollo 8 and the really famous Apollo 11, and he was the lunar module pilot for Apollo 13.
Next up, we've got Ken Mattingly, who's played by Gary Sinise. Ken was pretty cool. He was an officer, an aviator, aeronautical engineer, test pilot, and rear admiral in the US Navy. He was meant to be the command module pilot, but was replaced. He was, however, involved in bringing the crew home as he ran power-saving simulations which the crew used.
Lastly, we've got Gene Kranz, played by Ed Harris. Gene has become a little bit of a hero of mine in researching this film.
Seriously, you haven't stopped talking about him since we've been filming this episode.
I know, it's probably getting quite annoying at this point.
That's alright.
He was the flight team director when the explosion happened, and it was his team that did most of the calculations and set the constraints on resources to help bring the crew back to Earth. What I really like about him is an impassioned address that he made to his flight control team after the tragic events of Apollo 1, which came to be known as the Kranz Dictum. He famously said that NASA must be tough and competent. He just wanted NASA to be totally accountable for everything they did in the future and to make sure that nothing like this ever happened again, and that every mission they did was 100% right.
I can see why you like him.
Yeah, he is a pretty cool guy.
But in the film, we see that it's Gene that says the famous line, "Failure is not an option."
Failure is not an option.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that became the tagline of the film,
It
right?
did indeed, yeah.
But in reality, this was said by a guy called Jerry Bostick, who was a flight dynamics officer. Did you know that?
I did know that, yeah.
Well, Gene is great, but Jerry, man, it's a great line. Now, moving on to main points of the plot. The director, Ron Howard, went to great lengths to make sure that even the smallest details were as correct as possible. And what's pretty cool is that instead of using typical Hollywood things like harnesses, they actually filmed a lot of the zero-G sequences in the Boeing KC-135 reduced gravity aircraft, also known as the Vomit Comet. So like in the film, it is actually true that after the explosion, the crew did have to move out of the command module and into the lunar landing module. the lunar module was only meant to keep 2 people alive for a day and a half, instead of 3 people alive for 3 to 4 days. Even though you might think it was the lack of oxygen that was the biggest problem they faced, it was actually the build-up of CO2, and this led to one of the plot points that we wanted to talk about.
Okay, people, listen up. We gotta find a way to make this fit into the hole for this, using nothing but that.
As we can see, the team have to improvise a working filter using only the available parts that they've got on the ship. However, in a 2001 interview, Ken Mattingly revealed that whilst it kind of looks like they're just making stuff up in the film from scratch, they actually got the idea for how the filter was going to work from something that happened on Apollo 8. There was a similar problem on Apollo 8. Some guy who was working on that mission was working on the Apollo 13 mission. He said, hey guys, this worked back then, why don't we try that now?
That's pretty cool. So without knowing it, they were pretty much prepared for every eventuality of Apollo 13.
Exactly, yeah.
Pretty cool.
Yeah, it's pretty cool.
And it leads on quite nicely to something else that Mattingly was involved with. So in the film, we see that Mattingly is working really hard to get a set of instructions up to the astronauts so that they can keep enough power in the lunar module to get back to Earth safely. But in reality, these instructions were already drawn up.
Yeah, exactly. They had this lifeboat procedure ready to go, and all Mattingly was doing in reality was just verifying that those instructions would work.
That's pretty cool. Does that remind you of a certain someone?
That does, yeah. It takes us quite neatly back to Gene Kranz. He wanted NASA to be tough, he wanted NASA to be competent, ready for every eventuality. And that's exactly what they were for Apollo 13, fully prepared.
Actually, yeah, you're right. I agree with you. Gene is a pretty sweet guy.
Yeah, he's very, very important in the history of NASA and in human spaceflight.
Yeah. At the end of the film, Tom Hanks does a really good job at telling us what happens to the main characters after the events of the film. Interestingly though, Fred Hayes, played by the late great Bill Paxton, became a test pilot on the space shuttle program.
And my hero, Gene Kranz, he continued until the end of the Apollo space program up to Apollo 17, and his last mission was actually to send some astronauts into space to repair the Hubble Space Telescope in 1993.
Overall, Ron Howard and his crew did an amazing job at sticking true to the story and creating an amazing film which has become one of our favourites.
Yeah, absolutely, and that opinion is backed up by the man himself, Jim Lovell, who said it's really amazing. Everything, the instrument panels, the console switches, that's exactly what it looks like inside.
And that just speaks for itself really, when you've got actual astronauts that are from the actual event telling you you've done a good job and giving you a thumbs up. I think you can give yourself a pat on the back.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thanks for watching, guys. If you like what you see, definitely drop us a comment down below and leave a like because it will help us out a lot. Consider subscribing if you haven't already. We've got a lot more to come.
Yeah, loads of different ideas in the works, not just real or fake. We've got lots of different ideas based on different types of films that we can do in the future.
But if you do like real or fake, definitely leave us a comment letting us know what film you want us to do an episode on in the future. That's it for now. I'm Tom.
I'm Matt.
We'll see you next time.